The legal department here at Bullock's Rules for Writing does more than just burn popcorn in the break room. They want me to say that advanced placement is a registered trademark of the College Board and that the College Board is not approved, sanctioned, or in any way associated themselves with Bullock personally or Bullock's Rules for Writing. I'm just a guy with an unmonetized YouTube channel. Please don't sue me, College Board, please. And a dream. And a theme song. Welcome to the final episode in our series on the AP English Language and Composition course and exam. And we are talking synthesis. Now, in the writing section of the exam, synthesis is question 1. So why is this the last video? Well, as I've said before, if you can write a good argument and you know how to analyze sources, you can write a good synthesis. Those are basically the two skills that are mostly being tested in the synthesis essay. So real quick, a recap of my rules of argument since your synthesis essay is an argument. Number 1, define your terms. Number 2, state your claim. And number 3, use real evidence. These are probably not going to be too big of a concern, but synthesis also does require us to talk about my little known 4th rule of argument, which is you are not the first. Basically, anytime you are writing about anything, you are joining a larger, longer conversation. It's a conversation about this topic that started way before you got here. It's a conversation about this topic that's going to keep going way after you are done with it. And you have to sort of slip your way into it, make your points, gather together the evidence that supports your points, and then you can gracefully make your way out of that conversation. You are not the first. In a good synthesis essay, you are in that conversation and you are driving your part of that conversation. The sources are only there. They are only there for evidence. For the synthesis essay, the prompt looks the same every year. They're always structured the same. And you can use that to your advantage, because if you know what the synthesis essay prompt looks like, you can go through it very quickly and not waste a lot of time reading things that you don't need to read. I'm going to put one up on the screen. I'm going to kind of talk you through it, and I'm going to go from the bottom up. So right at the very bottom, you see some white space and you see the list of sources. I'm going to come back to that white space and list of sources later in this video. Moving up from that white space, you see the 3rd paragraph of the prompt. And this paragraph is the same every single time. Every single time. Now, I'm not going to ask you to memorize it, but you need to know that it covers a couple of important things. It says your argument should be the focus of your essay. That means the sources are only there for support. Your ideas are in charge. It says you use the sources to develop your argument and explain your reasoning for it. Avoid merely summarizing the sources. A critical danger on this particular essay is that you structure your writing in such a way that it either is or looks a whole lot like you're just summarizing your sources. Your first body paragraph talks about what's in source A, your second body paragraph talks about what's in source C, your third body paragraph talks about what's in source E, and then you got a conclusion. That's really more of a summary and not a synthesis. And then it says, gives you the directions about indicating clearly which sources you're drawing from, whether through direct quotation, paraphrase, or summary. So basically any reference, direct or indirect, to information from the sources should really be cited. And you've got a couple of choices on how to do that. The easiest way is just to say source A. There's also in parentheses, it will give you the name of the author, or if it's chart, it'll say chart. But really, source A, source B, source C, if you can just consistently train yourself to do that, that's going to save you some time. The middle paragraph of the prompt, half of it is the same all the time, and it's the first part, where it says carefully read the following 6, sometimes 7, sources, including the introductory information from each source, then synthesize material from at least 3 of the sources and incorporate it into a coherent, well-written essay. And here, only after essay in which do you get your actual question. Everything else in that paragraph is the same every single time. In this case, it's about libraries. So you develop a position on the role, if any, that public libraries should serve in the future. So that middle paragraph contains what your essay must actually be. Then you go up to the first paragraph, and the first paragraph is always some background. Look, AP is not going to ask you about things that they expect you to have no experience with at all. Things that are completely beyond your ken. Something that is just so out of the blue, out of the box that 99 or 100% of the students who are taking this exam have no idea what it is before they read the sources or this paragraph about background. Now, sometimes it's a very narrow and specialized topic that you may not think you know a lot about, but then as you're looking at the sources, you realize you do. But other times it's something like libraries, which everybody should know about. They are not going to ask you about anything controversial. It's not going to be about climate change. It's not going to be about abortion. It's not going to be about gun control or the death penalty or whether or not they should let Zack Snyder keep making DC movies. The answer, of course, is no, but it's not going to be anything controversial like that. But they still give you this paragraph of background to make sure that you can go into this essay prepared enough to understand what's in the sources. So, normally when I talk about synthesis in class, I have two rules. Your ideas drive the synthesis, and don't summarize, but rather bring sources together in your paragraphs. Now, AP has that covered with that third paragraph that is the same every single time, and you can just remember what's in it, and then you don't have to read it, and you've saved yourself a little bit of time. So instead, I have some rules for taking the synthesis part of this exam, for writing the essay on, in this one specific circumstance. And rule number one is fill the page before you turn the page. The page that I just showed you, that sample synthesis prompt, that should be your focus for a solid 10 minutes at the beginning of your writing time. Maybe 7, maybe 8, depending. But you want to fill the page, and you want to fill it, first of all, with your own answer to the question. In this particular instance, they've asked you about libraries. What role, if any, should libraries play in the future? You maybe never knew you had an opinion on it, but now that you're being pressed for an opinion, you probably have one. So write down, what do you think your answer is? Don't look at the sources. Don't care what their answer is at this moment. Instead, care what your answer is. Brainstorm some reasons why that answer is true, and start writing a list of things that you can talk about as you write this essay. You need to fill all of that white space at the bottom of the page before you turn the page to start looking at what the sources say. Once you finally do turn the page, my second rule is WW2. And no, I'm not talking about World War II. That's an acronym. It's for who, it's for where or when, and 2 paragraphs. WW2. When you look at the sources, as soon as you open to the first source, you're going to see there's a square box or rectangular box at the top of the page. There's some italics underneath that. Read it. You are going to read that for every single source. And before you read the words of the source, you're going to read that box, and you are going to figure out, okay, who is it who is talking in this source? For example, source A on that library prompt is an interview with a past president of the American Library Association. Do you think she might have some bias? Do you think that might be something to consider when you or if you use her as a source? Absolutely. That's why you need to see who it is who's writing. Then where? Where was this published? Is this from a newspaper that you've heard of and that you trust? Is this from a nonprofit organization? Or is this from some random blog that somebody is writing in their mother's basement? Where it's published can be very relevant, and sometimes when. If the topic might be time dependent, if there's a source that's older or that might have outdated information, then you might want to consider whether or not you would use that source, and if you do use that source, whether or not to talk about the fact that it's outdated. Then, once you've read that box, you've read those italics, read the first paragraph and the last paragraph of that source. doing all of that, looking at the information at the top, reading the first paragraph, reading the last paragraph, should give you a sense, based on your own brainstorm and your own answer that you did first, should give you a sense of whether or not that source is going to be useful to you. Because here's a dirty secret about the AP synthesis question. When it says, carefully read the following 6 sources or 7 sources, that is a lot. You simply do not have time to carefully read every single one of those sources. You need to be able to judge quickly, before you start planning your whole essay, which sources you're going to read in depth and which ones you're not. So you need to sort of start categorizing the sources immediately into useful or useless. The default should kind of be useful, right? The people who have written this question have spent a lot of time thinking about it, a lot of time researching it, a lot of time finding these sources, making sure that it's only the best sources that are available are on the exam, and that there's a variety of different sources from a variety of viewpoints. The people who wrote the question think every source is useful. But for you, you are going to have to say about some of them, no, that's not useful. Things that might make it not useful. It agrees too much with what another source already says that you think is easier to read and is useful. Or you know, it's just too hard to read. You start reading it, you don't understand. You don't have time to figure out what that source is saying. If you're looking at it and you're like, this doesn't make any sense to me, you know what? It's useless. Move on. One thing that you should consider is that a source can be useful if it seems to take the opposite opinion of you. Because one pretty smart move that you can make in writing your synthesis essay on this exam is to say, there's this counter argument that some people are making, including whoever it is in this source, but they're wrong, and then explain why. So it's addressing that counterclaim and explaining why the counterclaim is not more valid than your own claims. So just because something disagrees with you doesn't mean that you should make it useful. Now, or useless, sorry. Now you might decide if there are 2 things that disagree with you in different ways, and one of them is easier to rebut, well, you take the harder one and you make that one useless. But WW2 is a process of going through these sources as quickly as you can to categorize them into useful and useless, so that then, when you're ready to write this essay, you can read more carefully only those sources that you think are useful. My third rule considers the sources that you don't have to read in a traditional sense, and that's the visual argument. There's always at least one visual argument. It's a chart or a graph or a photograph or a cartoon, a political cartoon or a comic strip or something like that. There's always a visual source. So my rule number 3 is that the visual source is your 4th source. That's the source that's going to take the least amount of time to read, and as long as you actually understand it, then you can use it as your 4th source. The challenge is that there are a lot of students who write the synthesis essay and they use the visual source as one of their sources, the visual argument as, like central to something they're trying to say, and then they're either misreading it or there's just not enough there in that source for it to really make the case or be the evidence that the students think they need. So the visual argument is your 4th source. And finally, my 4th rule for this synthesis exam essay is start the essay with a relevant personal anecdote. As I said, they're not going to pick a topic that is completely off your radar. You're going to have some connection to it in some way. And there's some really good reasons to start with an anecdote. Number 1, it's different. There are a lot of students who write this essay and they start by sort of rewriting or paraphrasing that very first paragraph from the prompt that defines the issue and gives background. Readers hate that. So start with an anecdote. Second, it sets a tone and it guarantees that your argument is going to be kind of central to this because you've already put yourself into this essay. And importantly, very importantly, I believe, starting with an anecdote at the beginning gives you a such an easy option for your conclusion. I mean, you may have just this banging conclusion idea that you want to do, and you do it and it's perfect, but you get to the end of your time on this essay and you know you need to sum it up somehow. Well, why don't you circle back around to that anecdote, and like, well, if I could go back and talk to my 13-year-old self about how to use that library, now I would say blah, blah, blah. And that's a very nice way to wrap up your essay in a neat little bow. Now, all of those rules should leave you in a pretty good place to handle the essay. But I want to talk a bit about your synthesis essay outline because, as I said before, if you're just talking about one source per paragraph, there's a tendency either to resort to summarizing that source, or it's going to look and feel like you're summarizing that source, and the reader isn't really going to pick up on the analysis. So the guiding principle for the outline for your synthesis essay really needs to be, this is a conversation. I am in this conversation, and here's my idea. And you know what? Other people have said similar things or opposite things. And now I want to address what they have said and how that supports me, or why they are wrong, or how these sources are talking to each other in order to make my own understanding of this concept richer. So basically, your introductory paragraph is your anecdote plus your possible answer. Now, I know what you're thinking, not because I'm psychic, because psychics continue not to be real, but because I've had many students, and you're thinking, all right, what if I think I have an answer, and then I start looking at these sources and I read a few of them and my answer changes? You know what? That's amazing. That is perfect. You can talk about that. You are in this essay. You are synthesizing these sources to put out your argument, and that could even be your anecdote. I used to think that we want to keep libraries around forever, but the fact is that blah, 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 that's like a brilliant way to introduce this. So if your original opinion has changed, please do not chain yourself to that original opinion. Obviously, the sources are going to inform what you believe. So that's your introduction. Then each body paragraph needs to bring together at least 2 sources. This is not a hard and fast rule, and your teachers are going to show you sample student essays that scored well, where there were paragraphs that only talked about one source. If you can talk about one source and you can do a really good and deep analysis of it and tie it back to what it is that you're saying about the topic, go for it. But if you really want to avoid looking and feeling or actually summarizing the sources, bring them together in conversation in the same paragraph. Another way to really ensure that you're doing synthesis and that you're making these sources talk to each other is that you take each source and you use it more than once. So that you might, and I'm going to use XYZ for your 3 sources instead of ABC to work with me here. So let's say that in your first paragraph, you make your point and you say there's some evidence for that in source X and in source Y, and look at that, they're talking. And then in your second body paragraph, you say, here's another point, and look, this is in source Z, but that really complements what source X said. And then your third body paragraph, you probably figured out, you bring in Y and Z together. You can even have a point where you've got that source that disagrees with you, and you put that source in conversation with the source that does agree with you. Look, I can't teach you how to write an amazing synthesis essay over the span of this video, but I can assure you that if your goal is to bring the sources together in paragraphs, in conversation with each other and with you and your ideas, then your synthesis essay is going to be great and you will score well. Now, I want to address very quickly the outlier situation, which is that you come up with your idea, you read the sources, none of the sources really support that idea, and they're not persuasive enough to you to change your idea. So let's say for the libraries, you say, you know what, libraries are absolutely useless. We should sell the books, we should sell the buildings and sell the land, fire all the people, and lower taxes. None of the sources actually support that. So what you can do is you can set it up as sort of an antagonistic conversation. So you bring 2 sources that might agree with each other together in your paragraph, but then you have to go to town on them and explain, nope, that's not good enough. We need to be saving the taxpayers' money. These buildings can be repurposed for other things, and whatever it is that you need to do in order to make that point where you just are disagreeing with every source. It can happen, and it can work if you're careful about it. And now finally, pacing. When AP added the synthesis essay to the exam, they added 15 minutes to the exam time because they said we can't ask these students to read all of these sources and write an essay without adding some time. So they did. And you really need to spend the first 10 minutes of the exam time, of the writing exam time, just on the synthesis essay. So you fill the page before you turn the page, and then you start doing your WW2. Figure out what sources are going to be useful and useless. You also want to use some of that 15 minutes to look at the argument question 3, and look at the prompt and skim over the passage for the analysis question, which is question 2. And then you write them in any order you want. The essays that you think you can do the best on, you should write those first. You don't have to write it 1, then 2, then 3, although most students do. So there's that 10 minutes at the beginning that you should be doing this. And then you want to take about 40 more minutes of the time. So basically the recommended time for writing the essay, your 2 hours divided by 3 essays, is 40 minutes. And you want to take the first 15 minutes, maybe 20 minutes, really to plan, where you actually do read all of those useful sources. You do make sure that you understand the visual source so that if you bring it in as your 4th source, it makes sense. And do a little bit of an outline. Figure out which sources are going to come into conversation where in your essay. That's the first 15 or 20 minutes. Then you've got 20 minutes or so to write, and then you can take the last 5 minutes to do a proofread. And I've talked about this in the previous episodes. The readers don't care that you cross stuff out, that you change things. They actually like to see that. It's evidence of your critical thinking. So 15 minutes, maybe 20 minutes with the sources, 20 minutes of writing, and take a little bit of time there at the end to proofread. And remember, you're wearing your dumb watch. There it is. That's on this camera now. You're wearing your dumb watch, so you are able easily to pace yourself and do this. And hey, we have got to the end of this series. This is not the end of the channel. The very next series is going to talk about another important exam, which is the ACT. There are English-related things on the ACT exam, and that's what the next series is going to be about. So you know what? I will see you for the next one. My third rule, that was loud. My third rule